All right. So, where we're at. So I uploaded, let me see. So you can still see kind of all your individual iClicker scores. I then kind of put the one up with the two lowest drop. I also have it factored in. I think I gave everybody 5 points of extra credit since plenty of people beat me in the bracket thing. So a lot of you ended up with a really, really high score in that iClicker category. Should kind of help your grade out. I think I forgot to put a figure out your grade tool up now that I'm saying this. So I'll get that up this afternoon. Did I not put one up here? Yeah. So I'll get kind of this Excel file where you can kind of plug in your iClicker score, your kind of current scores in the homeworks, your first exam score, and then you can kind of play around with hypothetical project and final values to kind of see what your end result or end grade would be in the class. I've noticed some of you sort of putting up your projects. So I go up here. Project submission, right, is where you'll kind of submit that project. If you put them up there early, I'm going to assume that you're done with them. I actually going to start kind of grading those so I can kind of get those knocked out a little bit quicker. Like I said, I just noticed that there was a few of them sitting in there, right? Obviously, that fifth homework, I won't kind of get graded until after the due date, which is this Friday. Once again, I'm dropping the lowest, so this was kind of like a not, I mean, I guess it's like a kind of mandatory. If you've done the first 4 homeworks, you don't do this one, you just do whatever your first 4 homeworks are. This is one to be like, if you didn't do well on one of the homeworks or you forgot to turn one in, this would be kind of to replace that, right? So I end up dropping the lowest. So if you've done the first 4 and you're happy with that, you don't have to do this 5th one, it'll just get dropped. As soon as that due date passes, I'll get up an answer key for that, so you can kind of have that as an additional study tool. I also put up the answer key to that 4th homework, right? So you can kind of review that as well. And then what we'll start doing today, what did I call it? Final exam practice materials. We'll start kind of working through some of these questions. Okay. Actually, I think I mentioned too, I was planning on doing kind of more review on Monday, but we actually won't be able to meet on Monday. That's something that I apparently have to do. So I will do review today, do review on Friday, kind of get those, everything we work through. I'll post those videos so you can kind of go back and look at those as well. I'll mainly focus on these since I kind of give you a pretty good answer key to the other one. Also, you have those answer keys to the homework, so those will be really good study materials as well. Okay. So, and I think going back to homework 3, so 3, 4, and 5. Okay. Other than that, projects due by the end of this week. If you need any last minute help on that, I'll be in my office today 2 to 4, tomorrow 2 to 4. Or by kind of appointment. If those times don't work, you shoot me an email. We can try to find a time that works. Okay. Any other questions before we kind of get started here? Okay. So let's take a look at some of these problems. So let's do the additional final questions. So you kind of notice I threw in some short answer, also some multiple choice. So you kind of have a combination of those two. Now, any of these that are multiple choice, I can kind of turn into a short answer and vice versa, right? So let's look at this first one. So assume that we have women's soccer players at every quality level are paid less than men's soccer players with identical quality. Which of the following reasons could be a correct justification for why the U.S. soccer team earning less than the U.S. men's soccer team is an example of gender discrimination, right? So we've got in the data, we can see that female wages are lower, right? So let's think about which of these would be an example of why they actually are, should be the same as the male or should be higher than what they are. So if we had higher ticket prices for U.S. men's soccer games, what's that going to do to my demand curve? So if I think about how all these are going to play out, if my demand curve for labor is the marginal revenue per win times marginal wins coming from labor, if ticket prices are higher, each win is bringing in additional revenue, right? Or whatever the revenue was before, plus the additional kind of increase in the price of the ticket. So that would be evidence that we would likely see. We just assume that supply of labor is constant between men, I should just use an M here, and women, right? However, the higher ticket prices would suggest that the demand for male labor would be a little bit higher than female labor, leading to kind of lower wages for women, right? So having higher ticket prices, that wouldn't be identification of gender discrimination, because the higher ticket prices for male games would actually indicate that the wages should be higher, right? So that one's not our answer. We then kind of go back, higher supply of US women's soccer players, right? So if instead we had demand being exactly the same, right? But we had a higher supply, so at every wage level, you can kind of think about it, at every wage level, there's a higher supply of females, right? So supply of labor for women, if it was instead down here, well, same kind of idea. We would now have, I said, man, probably should have just drawn this again, but here now, well, we'll draw it again just to make the point. Okay. So, do a real quick sketch here. So here, if we assume that the demand is the same for both men and women, but that the supply of labor for men is not as great as the supply of labor for women, well, that would also predict that if we're looking at kind of overall wages and just comparing the average wage, we would expect female wages to be lower there as well, or the women's team's wages. So that one's not gonna, it's not necessarily discrimination. Greater TV viewership and broadcast deals for women's soccer games, or none of the above. Well, if we did see larger deals in women's soccer games, it would basically have been our first scenario, just flip-flopped, right? Because it would predict the higher marginal revenue per win for the women's division or league. And so then you would predict that female wages should be higher. So if you see them actually be below the males, now you know that's discrimination. So C, kind of having those higher, what did I call them, broadcast revenue and kind of TV viewership. If we did see higher TV viewership and broadcast deals for US women's soccer game, and we still saw the wages being lower, that would be the one that would be an evidence of discrimination, right? So they're thinking about kind of demand and supply kind of differences in the labor market, comparing different groups. There we did kind of male, female, but this could be, any other type of discrimination, domestic, foreign, white versus non-white. We would want to know, kind of start thinking about where wages should be even without discrimination. Here's one we'll play around with for a bit. So suppose the union and the league are bargaining on the new maximum salary amount for players. The union would accept any value above 25 million, and the league will accept any value below 30. Right? So we'll kind of set this up, this contract zone. So the union is always going to want higher player maximums, right? And the league is always going to want lower ones, right? So if we had an example like this, we would say the contract zone is really going to be, we can come to an agreement somewhere between 25 and 30, right? Because any value in that range is going to be okay with both sides. Okay? If you start to get the union offering wages below, if the league starts offering the union wages below 25 million, there's going to be no deal. If the union offers the league wages above 30 million, there's going to be no deal, right? Only somewhere in between. However, what happens if instead the union believes the league will take anything less than 28 million, right? So here, the union believes that the league is actually kind of less, is even more of a stickler against paying these high maximum contracts. So they actually would only agree to 28 million or less. Well, now our new contract zone has shrunk, right? But what could the negative impact be here, right? Well, if they expect that this is kind of the highest value that the league would take, what values will the union no longer offer? They believe that they won't take anything over 28 million. They'll no longer offer anything up here, right? When they actually could
and get away with it, right? So now the highest that the union underneath these pessimistic beliefs would offer is 28 million. They could have got away with actually offering 29, 30 million. So the result of this pessimism is going to be that they propose an offer that's lower than what they could have ended up, like, could have pushed for, right? They could have pushed even higher. Now, if they get very pessimistic, so this was not in the problem, so we'll answer this one and then I'll kind of add in what things I think are important. Which of the scenarios are most likely to occur? The union, right, was offering things that were lower than what they could have gotten, so they're going to lose out in some potential surplus, right? They're going to end up with a maximum salary of 28 million when they could have gotten 29 or 30, right? So they lost out a little bit. The union lost out. What if instead they believed that the league wouldn't take anything, I don't know, would only accept things 20 million or below? Well, now what's going to occur here? If they believe this is true, then the union is going to actually, they don't think there's any value that they can propose that the league would take. So here we might see kind of the result of this be a strike, right? Because of their overly pessimistic beliefs that actually led to them not kind of putting any offers in at all and having a strike. But if they're only slightly pessimistic, a strike wouldn't occur. They're just actually going to be potentially losing out on additional surplus. Okay. Questions on this?
What's the difference between a strike and a lockout in this situation?
Yeah, so here it would be dependent on the party who will not make an offer, right? So here it's the overly pessimistic beliefs by the union. So if the union doesn't believe there's an offer that, you know, there's a value that they can make an agreement with, the union will go on strike, right?
Oh, but if it's the league.
If it's the league, then that's a lockout. So we could also think of like a scenario. It's a good question. So let's do the same values. But let's say that now, remember this was league, unions, or contract zones. So let's say now that the league thinks that the union won't take anything below 28 million, right? So this is kind of their beliefs about what the union. Well, now the league, if they're kind of proposing an amount, they're only going to propose an amount where they think an agreement can be made, when they could have actually bargained for even lower, right? So here, once again, pessimistic beliefs by the league lead to a loss of surplus, right? Oh, I should try to keep the colors the same. Now, if they become too pessimistic, right? So maybe they believe that the union won't take anything below 35. Well, that's where we now think there isn't an agreement that can be made, and the league says, based off of what I think the union is going to do, you know, there's nothing we can propose to come to an agreement. Now, hopefully, these beliefs get updated very quickly. Hopefully, they're not just shutting it down completely. They're actually trying to gather more information about where the actual kind of threat points are at. But if we did have this overly pessimistic view, it could lead to the league instituting a lockout. Questions on that? Keep moving. Okay. So.
That should cover this one. Let me think if there's anything else I wanted to say. Oh, since we're doing this, I kind of gave you examples of pessimism, but you could have optimism as well. So I just want to go through at least one of those to think about how that can actually be a bad thing, right? So same setup. I can spell union. Got the league up here. 30 mil, 25, right? Let's suppose that the union has overly optimistic beliefs about the league, right? Or the teams. So they think that the teams would be willing to take anything up to 35. What could be a potential downfall or the downside of this optimistic belief? What's a value that the union could propose? 33 million. Will that be accepted by the league? No, right? The league's actual threat point is at 30 million.
this overly optimistic belief might lead to the union initially proposing values that are way too high. Because the league won't accept these, we would have a lockout, right? Yeah, so overly kind of optimistic, we may make a proposal initially that is much higher than what the actual threat point is, which would kind of lead to lockout, and then vice versa on the other side, we would have a strike if the league had extremely, optimistic beliefs about what the union would take. Any questions on that? Okay with that?
I don't think those ones should be too bad. I can kind of guarantee you'll see some of the contract zone optimism and pessimism on the exam. So this one is, let's assume we have a free and open labor market. I said no roster caps or anything. If the competitive balance in the NBA has been increasing and fans like competitive balance, which of the following would expect to happen to wage and the number of players in the NBA, right? So
here we're thinking about what's happening to the quantity of labor and wages, right? So if, should be pretty simple. See, I'm not trying to make these too hard. But if I've got some original demand curve for labor, and then competitive balance is increasing, right? What's going to happen to my demand curve for labor? First of all, I should probably identify these equilibrium wages and quantity of labor first. Okay. So if I have increased competitive balance, what's going to happen in my labor market here? Yeah, why is it going to go up? Remember, the demand curve for labor is based off the quality of that labor, but also how much the product, additional wins the players bring in, how much those are worth to the team. Well, if competitive balance is increasing, we know that increases demand for the sport, which also is increasing kind of the marginal revenue, right, derived from each win. So anything that increases demand for the sport will increase demand in the labor market, because those same players, even of the same quality, they're now bringing in a higher additional amount of revenue. So we would expect to see, anytime there's an increase in demand for the sport, we would expect to see wages and the number of players in that sport increase. Now, if there were roster limitations, what would that do, right? Well, let's just say, for instance, really the only thing that would change, see if I left myself enough room here. Yep. So let's say we have, first of all, are there any questions on that before I add in another thing? Okay. Let's say I had a roster limit that was actually being met before, right? So that the number of players in the league, like there's only, however many, I don't know, what is a NBA roster, or 15 or something. So then multiply that by the number of teams, and like that would be kind of the roster limit, right? So we know that if that was being met before, it had to be somewhere below the old equilibrium. So the only thing that's going to change if we did have kind of a roster limit and it was being met, we'll notice at that roster limit, how much were teams willing to pay? Oh, here we go. We'll do this all in green. Right? W1 and then W2 would just be way up here, right? So the quantity of labor wouldn't change because we're hitting that roster limit, but you're still going to get the same prediction about that the other group's wages are going to be higher, right? It's just that instead of where does that demand curve hit the supply curve, our supply curve gets chopped off wherever that limit is, right? As soon as we hit that roster limit, it's like our supply curve becomes a vertical line. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving?
Okay. So the original one here, we didn't have a roster limit. We should see an increase in wages and in the number of players. Yeah. Let me think of a good one I want to go through that we haven't done for a while. So let's see. Well, we'll work through these. We'll get some math in. So
I also might do something similar to the third homework where I combine these contract zones with this idea of kind of monopoly and monopsony power. So let's say I've got, I'm looking at the NBA, I've got a demand curve for labor and I've got a supply curve for labor.
I then assume that every team acts as a monopoly. What will the equilibrium wage, number of players, and deadweight loss be? So I'm thinking about kind of if these I don't want the teams acting as a monopoly here because I have the NBA teams. This is written backwards. I'll update this after class. So, right, we have the teams acting as monopsonists. And the union is going to act like a monopoly. So let's go up here. What did I want to get at? Yeah, so I want to do teams acting like monopsonists, right? So this first one, we have the NBA teams being the only kind of consumer of labor. So they're going to have monopsony power. So we've got, let me write these down before I switch over. 170 minus 4Q. And then 10 plus 2Q. Okay. So we've got our supply and demand curves, right? I can kind of draw a visual here. I think that would usually generally help. So I'm thinking about, here's my demand curve for labor. Here's my supply curve. So my demand curve, I know is going to start out at 170. I know my supply curve starts out at 10, right? Now, if I have monopsony power, it works a little bit different. So when we have monopoly power in the market, we have a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. When you have monopsony power, you're the only purchaser. We end up with a marginal expenditure curve that's twice as steep as supply. So if I wanted to know my marginal expenditure here, this would start at the same place, but be twice as steep. Okay. So now what quantity is it optimal for these teams, these monopsonists, to kind of target? It's going to be the point where, so we're always trying to do, remember, you can kind of think about supply, that wage is representing marginal costs, demand kind of reflecting marginal benefits. However, if I have monopsony power, I'm actually going to base my decision off of this marginal expenditure curve. Okay. So this is like the player's marginal cost. Here's the team's marginal expenditure. So this is like the team's costs. So there choose the quantity where marginal expenditure is equal to demand, right? How do we find that point? Well, my demand curve, set it equal to my marginal expenditure curve. And now it's just a little bit of algebra, right? So I start moving things around. I get what? 160 is equal to 8Q. So what? Q is equal to 20. I'm doing the math in my head correct there. Yeah.
The 10 plus 4Q or 10 plus 2Q.
So to find this point, it should be 10. Well, did I write what was the original supply? 10 plus 2Q? Yeah. So it should be, right, not my supply curve, but my marginal expenditure curve, which is twice as steep. Yep. Oh, sorry, I'm pointing to something that wasn't there. Marginal expenditure curve, which is twice as steep. If you were solving for this equilibrium point, like without monopsony power, then you would do a similar thing, but you're setting supply equal to demand. So then it would just be equal to 10 plus 2Q. In fact, we could do that here real quick as well. So 170 minus 4Q is equal to 10 plus 2Q. So 160 over 6. It's going to be what? 12, no. 26.67, I think. I don't know if that's right. I'm trying to do that in my head, but right, it would be a higher quantity. I think that's what it should be. Anybody want checking? I don't know. Again, I guess if my math's wrong, I can kind of take my word for it. So, how would I find the old equilibrium wage? Well, if I know the quantity, I can plug that into either my supply or demand curve, right? If I plug that into my supply or demand curve, so here I could just do 170
minus 4 times 26.67. That's going to be, I think, between 60 and 70 or something. Somebody wants to help me out with the math, right? But right, you could do that, right? You could just set, you find that equilibrium quantity, plug it back into your demand curve, and that would give you kind of that equilibrium wage. Guess I can do this and pull up Excel here real quick. Just so we have numbers that actually make sense. All right, so let's make sure I was right in the other one. Whoops. So 160 over 6. So then 10 plus 2 times this, 63.33. So 63.33 should be that equilibrium wage. Now, when we had the monopsony power, we found the quantity was 20. We actually need to plug that into either our demand or our marginal expenditure curve. So I'll plug it into my demand curve. So 170 minus 4 times 20, right? I can do that math a little bit easier in my head. I believe that's, 90, right? Okay. So you can kind of see when I have monopsony power, I would think, oh, what did I forget to do? Is this going to be my equilibrium wage? Let's think. With the teams having monopsony power, should that lead to having a higher wage? No. So what do I actually need to do? Shouldn't have plugged that quantity into my demand curve. The whole point was I know that players are willing to play for the point I'm at my supply curve. I actually should have been plugging that quantity into my supply curve here if I'm solving for that wage from monopsony. Now I can still use this value. This is still going to be something useful I could ask you another question on, but the actual wage under the monopsonist is going to be wherever I'm at down here. So my supply curve was what? 10 plus 2 times that quantity of 20. So I'm actually going to see under a monopsonist that equilibrium wage is going to be lower. And the number of workers is also going to be lower. So you find the quantity where marginal expenditure hits your demand curve. Once you have that quantity, plug it into your supply curve to get what that monopsonist wage would be. When it came to finding the equilibrium wage, it didn't matter if I plugged it into supply or demand because those were going to be going to be the same value. Any questions on this before we keep moving? So I've got this monopsony power. What if I asked you what's the dead weight loss associated with it? How would I find that?
Use a triangle.
Yeah,
Right,
this
20, yeah.
guy right here, right? So it'd be what? 90 minus 50. So this is where if I hadn't have done that, I was trying to say like what's an easy mistake to do, which is to plug in here instead of the wage. But I would have had to find this value, right? And I would have found that value by simply plugging that quantity into my demand curve, right? So I've got the height of that triangle. The length will be 26.67 minus 20, and then times 1/2 because it's a triangle. Right? Any questions on this before people? I'm going to draw this I can do this with different colors. What area or areas would represent producer surplus here?
Below 90.
So remember, the actual wage that was being set was going to be down here, right? So the actual wage paid under the monopsonist would be 50. So it'd be the area above the supply curve, but under the wage they receive. So we've got producer surplus being relatively low. Why is that a bad thing? Who are our producers here? Our suppliers of labor. Players, right? So under this monopsony power, producer surplus goes down quite a bit. Where would my consumer surplus be? That's going to be the area below my demand curve, but above the price I'm paying or above the wage I have to give the players. So consumer surplus, we have like this rectangle and then this little triangle here as well. Any other questions on? I probably drew this extreme too. I had the surplus shift probably wouldn't be that large, but I just kind of. Yeah. Any questions on this? These are all kind of fair game questions. Knowing how to find producer and consumer surplus in the labor market, where deadweight loss would be from monopsony power. Now, we know this is the wage kind of that players would be last wage players would be willing to play at, right? So you can kind of think about it as I know that players will play for anything above that 50 amount, right? So this is kind of like my players, right? Now let's say instead of monopsony power, I've got the union also in the NBA, and what they're doing is exercising kind of monopoly power, right? They're the only suppliers of labor. If you want to hire, a player, they belong to the union. So before we had this set up, and now if I am looking at the union, what impacts that would have, they're going to go back to their monopoly. So they're going to have a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, which we go back, our demand was what, 170 minus 4Q, so minus 8Q. The union would set the quantity wherever marginal revenue hits that supply curve. So I'll set this marginal revenue equal to, I think what we had for supply was 10 plus 2Q. So set my marginal revenue equal to my supply curve. Do a little bit of algebra, get what, 160 over 10. So we get a quantity of 16. However, I then know, okay, the union would then know that the teams are willing to pay whatever their marginal benefit is or wherever they're at in the demand curve at that quantity. So how can I figure out the wage that well, actually, instead of calling this a monopolist, the union acting like a monopolist. How can I find that wage? I just take my quantity, plug it back into my demand curve. So 170 minus 4 times 16. That's what, 64. If I'm doing the math in my head correct here, would be a wage of 106. So if I ever give you a problem where I'm going kind of monopoly and monopsony power, it's probably easier to solve them individually on their own, right? Now we know that the teams will be willing to pay up to 106, right? So we kind of know the highest wage that the league would be willing to pay is up there at 106. So we could kind of use those 2 points really as our threat points, right? We know that the union will take anything over 50. So if we only have monopsony power, the teams could pay that low wage. We know that the league would be willing to take, pay up to 106. I mean, this is like thousands of millions, which means if I only had union or monopoly power, they would set the wage up there. If I have both of them at the same time, we're going to end up with them kind of arriving at some value in the middle, right? Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Anything here? Okay with that? Okay. I can guarantee you, like, I'll ask you something very similar to this on the exam. Knowing how to kind of look at monopoly power by the union and monopsony power from the teams in the labor market. Okay. I think we'll skip to 6 because I think I want to do it as is this discrimination? Okay, yep. So let's assume that we have the same supply of European players, or wait. The supply of European players is slightly lower than that of American players in the NBA. European players in the NBA are slightly higher quality. Suppose the salaries of the American players are greater. Use graphs with labor supply curve of why this might not be evidence of discrimination, or why it is. Okay. So we've got differences in supply, and if we have higher quality, we can think of that as a difference in the demand curve, right? Because our demand curve, really kind of hammering this home today, but our demand curve is the marginal revenue per win times the quality of the players, right? So we said this is a little bit higher for
Did I have the European players that were the higher quality? No, I forgot. Yeah, European are slightly higher quality. Okay, sorry.
I don't know why I couldn't find that. So we know that the European demand is going to be a little bit higher, right? So we can kind of adjust for that. So we've got the demand curve for European players is going to be a little bit higher than that of American players. Now we're also told the supply of European players is lower, right? So this is where if, you know, I was doing this, I might draw them out kind of individually, but we can put them all in the same graph. So we know that the demand difference, right, should cause, if we had the same supply, that demand difference should mean that European players are earning a higher wage, right? You kind of see that there because they're higher on average higher quality. Now, if I draw in the fact that they have lower supply, right, then actually I would expect the wage for European players to be even higher than if there were no supply differences, right? So they're higher quality, which means they should have a higher wage, and they have a higher supply. So under no way I could draw these shifts. I know both of them are pushing that wage up. There's no way in which seeing if and the data, if I saw European players being paid less, it would have to be evidence of discrimination, right? Because both that demand difference and that supply difference are going to mean that they should be earning a higher wage. So if they're not, that's evidence of discrimination. Any questions on this? I'm going to do a kind of similar thing, but a little bit different. So this way I had them both working the same direction. I might try to use a little more colors here to help highlight this. So let's instead, so I've got my demand curve for European players, got my demand curve for US players. Let's say I've got the supply curve for US players. So I know that the equilibrium wage for American players will be right here. Right? Now I know that the demand curve difference should push that European wage up a little bit higher, but let's also assume that not that we had less supply from European players, but we actually had more supply. Well, here's where it's an answer where or an answer that it depends, right? So if I think about really small changes in supply, well, if I were to hold constant demand, having a higher supply will actually mean that group should have a lower wage, right? So if I have a really slight increase in the supply of European relative to American players, then it still should be that I see European players earning a higher wage. However, if I have, I'm not sure I can draw this here, a large enough supply shift, well, now that equilibrium wage for my European players could be lower, right? So if I had the scenario where I had higher quality players for one group, but I also had higher supply, I really actually can't say, you know, that there's any discrimination going on. Because it could be that they should be getting paid a higher wage, it could be that they should be getting a lower wage. Questions on that? Okay. And just to kind of make the point before. So the reason why I knew that if I did see European wages be lower, that it would be discrimination is because the only way that this wage falls below the US wage is if the demand curve for European players has like this huge kind of discrimination cost in it as well. Remember, I say plus discrimination, but the discrimination is going to be like a negative cost. So this is just kind of like decreasing my demand curve. So if I am seeing wages that are below US wages for the European players, it would have to be from something that's shifting that demand curve, right? Some type of discrimination, maybe from employers, or it could be through consumer discrimination as well, right? Because consumer discrimination, remember we said, has a similar going to impact that marginal revenue per win. So while employers, we think of there's this additional cost, consumer discrimination is just going to decrease the demand curve by kind of eating into that margin, right? Any questions on that? Keep moving here.
Okay, so thinking about discrimination in the labor market, let me see what are these. I'm going to. I want to do this one. Pair the equilibrium number of games. No, I want to do something else that's not on here. So we'll do one more thing.
So let's instead assume that we've got. How do I want to do this? Let's assume that you've got employee discrimination going on. Okay? So if I have employee discrimination going on, so let's do my same two groups there. Let's say I've got an example now where let's assume that both European and USA basketball players have the exact same demand curve, right? They're the exact same quality, right? The teams are bringing the exact same marginal revenue per win, so their demand curves are the same, right? And then, why did I draw this? This isn't what I wanted. This isn't effective demand curve. I started talking, not thinking what I was doing. Here, so I want the supply curve to be the same between the two. Now my demand curve, right? I'm going to think about here's USA. Let's actually say we have the exact same demand curve as well, right? So for non-discriminatory employees, it should just be, I've assumed away any differences in the two groups' demand, right? So they're the same quality, same demand curve. I also assume they're supplying labor at the same amounts, right? Both European and USA players. So there's no differences. What I have differences in, so I can think about it as this is really representing the supply curve for my non-discriminatory players, right? And then everything will work out to be, they'll be getting paid the exact wage that they're kind of bringing a benefit to the team, right? Now, if I have discriminatory employees, what's going to shift here? So if the employees are discriminatory and they have to play, let's say US players discriminatory towards European players. So if the discriminatory employee joins a team and there's European players, what do we say is going to shift? Remember. Yeah, and I'll actually supply less, right? Because it's essentially like, we think about the marginal costs for our discriminating employees, it would be whatever the old marginal costs were, plus some additional discrimination costs. Like I now have this psychological cost because I have to play with these people that I'm discriminatory towards or against. So we should see the supply actually decrease, right? Higher marginal cost shifts that supply kind of up or kind of decreases that supply curve. So now for my discriminatory employees, if I want to hire them, I'm going to have to pay them this higher wage, right? If I can't find any other, if there are non-discriminatory employees out there, what this would mean is that, yeah, I'm just going to start replacing my discriminatory employees with these non-discriminatory employees, right? But if I eventually run out of non-discriminatory employees, I may have to then kind of default to paying these discriminatory employees a higher wage. Okay? Now, kind of an interesting thing to point out. What's happening to the number of discriminatory employees relative to the number of non-discriminatory employees? So the number of non-discriminatory employees hired is going to be, I'm sorry, this was just my discriminatory. It's going to be higher, right? In fact, if my discriminatory employees become like crazy, like they just refuse, right, to ever play with someone of the group they're discriminatory against, if that discrimination cost was high enough, what ends up being true about the equilibrium quantity of discriminatory employees that we see could be zero, right? So if we ever had kind of overly, extreme cost of discrimination, those players just end up they don't play in the league, right? This is the idea, like, you know, I'm sure there were some players like during integration that kind of boycotted, right? Like they weren't going to play. Well, what happened? Well, we're not going to pay you, you know, the significantly higher wage. We're just going to cut you, right? We're not going to have any discriminatory employees. Doesn't make any sense, right? We're never going to be willing to pay that high of a wage. A little bit more of a tough question here with this. So even if I assume, first of all, are there any questions before I complicate this a little bit? Okay. So clean this graph up. But if I assume that I'm getting the same, like I'm comparing two players, right? And I have my discriminatory and my non-discriminatory employees. You could, you know, have some demand curve, but what I was kind of more wanting to get at was, let's say that the quantity of labor that a player can supply is kind of limited, right? So even under this scenario, right, we kind of look at this and say, okay, I could get away at the same kind of quantity of labor, I would be paying whatever that gap is premium for, you know, if I had to hire a discriminatory versus a non-discriminatory player. So if I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about, okay, players quantity is fixed, I've got to, you know, pay discriminatory players this, non-discriminatory employees this. Now, remember, the wage of the discriminatory employee goes all the way down to this if I don't have any players of that group that they discriminate against. So if we think about the kind of European USA example, if I don't have any European players, well, essentially I'm getting away with kind of just paying these lower wages. So if I'm thinking about adding a European player, I'm going to have the additional costs for every discriminatory employee I have go up by this amount, right? If I was fixing the quantity of labor and I had discriminatory employees, now when I hire that European player, I'm paying this premium for each of those discriminatory employees. So it would have to be that if I add that up, like across all my players or those premiums I'm paying to discriminatory employees, if it is greater than, so think about here, if it's greater than the value of the marginal wins coming from whatever European player I'm adding is, then I won't add the European player, right? Now, if the value added of that European player ever gets above kind of this additional premium, then I'm okay paying it, right? But essentially, because I have these discriminatory employees for all of my European players, it kind of like now factors in that additional cost. So if I had discriminatory employees, what we would end up seeing for these European players, kind of think about it here, combine these two things. So let's say I've got my supply for the European players, and I have what the demand curve should be, right? Their value, the marginal wins that's coming from their labor. However, I just said, now the teams have to weigh out, well, what's that value? If I add the European player, I'm going to get that value, but I'm also getting this additional cost, right? So what that's going to do is it's actually going to decrease. So this is kind of plus the employee discrimination. So it's just going to decrease that demand curve, predicting that we see kind of, so European wages with discrimination, here's what they should be, right? So because we had employee discrimination, right, we have to pay those discriminatory employees higher. Whatever group's being discriminated against, that's going to mean that they're less valuable to the team if they have to add them, right? Because they now have to pay this additional premium to discriminatory employees. And we actually see that in the discriminated group because of this discrimination. It's like passed on, right, through the labor market, and they actually get a lower wage. Or the teams would be willing to pay them a lower wage, I should say. Questions on from there? All right. So I think we'll kind of end it there today. I'll go through the remaining questions on those additional practice ones. We'll also go through kind of the rest of that practice exam. I might bring in some questions of my own as well. that I think would be good to know for the exam on Friday. Do you have any questions, last minute questions on homework or project? I'll be in my office 2 to 4 today and tomorrow. Those times don't work for you, just shoot me an email and probably find another time tomorrow that works, or even a little bit later today. Okay. All right, I'll see you guys on Friday.